pickup truck, a rust-flecked beast of a Ford that had seen more miles than most men had breathed air, coughed its way deeper into the northern Montana wilderness. Dust, fine as baker's flour, coated everything inside the cab, settling over the worn dash, the cracked leather of the steering wheel, and the stacks of crumpled maps and dog-eared field guides that lived on the passenger seat. Daniel Hayes, a man whose eyes carried the deep, shadowed burden of horrors witnessed and deeds done, gripped the wheel, knuckles white, as the pitted gravel road wound itself tighter, ever deeper, into the ancient embrace of the conifer forests. Here the sun was a rumor, a distant memory. Even at high noon, a perpetual twilight reigned, filtered and bruised by the dense, needled canopy that knit itself together overhead, a natural dome of dark green and brittle brown. It was quiet, too quiet, save for the groan of the truck's tired engine and the occasional whisper of wind through the boughs, a sound that carried something just beyond hearing. The air itself was thick, a heavy blanket pressed against the lungs, smelling of pine sap and damp earth, of rich black soil and something else, something inexplicably wild, a primal scent that hummed just beneath the threshold of conscious thought. Shadows, long and shifting, danced between the colossal trunks, so deep and fluid they possessed a life of their own, coiling and uncoiling with unseen movements. Daniel had lived a life of violence, a monster hunter by trade, his reputation carved from the bodies of werewolves, vampires, and creatures unnamed, unspeakable. He'd wielded silver and fire, cold steel and colder resolve, dispatching threats with a ruthless pragmatism that had left a long, bloody trail across the forgotten corners of the American map. But the years had taken their toll, leaving him with a gnawing, aching weariness that went bone deep. The endless killing, the constant vigilance, the slow erosion of his own soul. It had all piled up, a monument of guilt and exhaustion. Now, unexpectedly, he felt a new, desperate desire to protect. This forest, with its ancient secrets and its shadowed whispers, represented a last, desperate chance at absolution, a way to find a different kind of meaning in a life defined by endings. He knew the alternative was a slow, quiet drowning in the depths of his own past, and he pursued this path. He passed the skeletal remains of what had once been farms, their fields choked with weeds, their barns sagging like broken teeth. Rusting combines stood sentinel, half swallowed by encroaching brush, silent testimonies to forgotten harvests. Windows of homesteads stared out like blind eyes, nailed shut with splintered planks, the wood faded and peeling. These places weren't merely abandoned. They screamed of hasty, irreversible flight, of lives uprooted not by economic hardship or the call of the city, but by something far more urgent and terrifying. He imagined the last families packing what they could, their faces pale, their hands trembling, the unspoken fear a palpable thing in the air they left behind. In a tiny roadside cafe, little more than a shack with a fading open sign, Daniel pulled in. The gravel crunched under his tires. Inside, the smell of stale coffee and fried grease hung heavy, a comforting counterpoint to the wild scent of the forest. The counter was sticky, the formica chipped, but the coffee was strong and black, just how he liked it. He took a seat at a worn booth nursing his mug and let the low murmur of local voices wash over him. The talk was quiet, hushed, the kind of conversation people only have when they're speaking of things they don't want to believe. He pieced together snippets. Gone again. cattle disappearing in whole herds. Something ain't right out in those woods. The words, spoken in fearful tones, confirmed what his own sources had hinted at. There was a palpable sense of unease, a tightening around the edges of reality that no amount of strong coffee could wash away. That first night, Daniel made camp far off the main track, burying his pickup deep in a grove of hemlocks. He didn't bother with a tent, preferring the open sky and the immediate connection to the earth, his instincts honed to a razor's edge. He unrolled his sleeping bag beside a small, carefully doused fire, the embers glowing like dying eyes in the growing darkness. The air grew colder as the night deepened, dropping into the low 40s, the kind of chill that promised a biting frost by morning. He lay awake, listening. He heard the familiar hoot of an owl, the rustle of unseen creatures in the underbrush, the distant, mournful cry of a coyote. But then, from the deepest reaches of the forest, something else cut through the night. It wasn't the clean, predatory howl of a wolf. This sound was deeper, more drawn out, a terrible symphony that intertwined human despair with animalistic rage. It twisted and coiled, rising to an agonizing crescendo before fading into a guttural moan that vibrated in Daniel's very bones. It was a sound unlike anything he had ever heard, and it pulled his senses taut, drawing every nerve ending to a point. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his gut, that these woods held something ancient and hungry, something beyond the usual run-of-the-mill monsters he'd spent a lifetime hunting. Sleep proved elusive in a place so charged with unseen energy. Daniel spread out his maps and printouts. Old, dog-eared topographic charts lay beside satellite images downloaded from encrypted sources. The printouts were dossiers, fragments of information gleaned over months of relentless tracking. He'd followed this particular pack for nearly half a year, piecing together a mosaic of disappearances, strange sightings, and local legends. He knew their territory, their patterns. More importantly, he knew something that most other hunters didn't, something that contradicted everything he'd been taught, everything he'd believed about their kind. These werewolves, this particular pack, didn't prey on humans. They held their ground, fiercely guarding their ancient territory, not from encroaching civilization, but from something far older, far more dangerous. His mission, then, was clear. Find them before the hunters, a different breed of monster entirely, men driven by greed and fear, began their bloody harvest. His thoughts drifted to his past, to the faces of those he'd killed, the justifications he'd offered himself. He saw now, with the painful clarity of hindsight, that he'd been wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong, about so much. These werewolves weren't just bloodthirsty beasts, blind destroyers. They were guardians balancing on a knife's edge, holding back a darkness that no human truly understood. He would protect them. He would stand between them and the hunters, accepting that this path might cost him his life. The bitter taste of pine needles mingled with the metallic tang of old regret in his mouth. He closed his eyes, the strange, mournful howl still echoing in the far reaches of the forest, and waited for the dawn. The heavy air, laden with the smell of pine and something else, something wild and untamed, pressed down on him, a physical weight. He faced the unknown, understanding the profound challenge ahead. The next morning, under a sky that remained a muted gray, Daniel Hayes drove his truck deeper into the Montana wilds, following a barely discernible trail that only a logger or a seasoned hunter would recognize. His destination was an abandoned logging camp, a ghost of an industry that had long since moved on, leaving behind a graveyard of rusted machinery and felled giants. The air grew colder as he ascended, the thermometer on his dashboard reading a crisp 38 degrees Fahrenheit. He aimed for this forgotten place. His intel, painstakingly gathered over long months, confirmed it as the perfect staging ground for hunters, hidden yet expansive enough to conceal their movements, far from any prying eyes. He found it eventually, a sprawling wound in the forest. Twisted, rust-eaten carcasses of enormous logging trucks lay half-submerged in overgrown clearings, their tires rotted, their windows shattered. Towering stacks of forgotten logs, once destined for distant mills, now lay blanketed in emerald moss, becoming one with the earth. Weather-beaten barracks, their roofs caved in like broken skulls, leaned precariously against the sturdy pine trees, whispering tales of long-departed men and their harsh, transient lives. It was an eerie place, steeped in the melancholy of forgotten labor. Yet Daniel felt a strange surge of purpose. This desolation, he knew, offered the perfect cover. He chose one of the sturdiest remaining sheds, a large rectangular structure made of corrugated steel that miraculously still held its shape. Its single grimy window was broken, jagged shards of glass protruding like teeth. The interior smelled of mildew, stale sawdust, and the faint, sweet decay of rodents. Over the next several hours, Daniel transformed it into his temporary stronghold. He cleared away the detritus, using a battered tarp to patch the window and another to cover a gaping hole in the roof. He camouflaged the shed's exterior with branches and brush, blending it into the surrounding gloom. He set up rudimentary tripwires and motion sensors, simple but effective noisemakers fashioned from empty cans and fishing line, just enough to give him an early warning. This was his home now, a cold, steel-ribbed shell, but it was his, and it offered a measure of security against the unknown. His first systematic reconnaissance of the camp yielded immediate chilling results. Near the main entrance, partially obscured by a tumble of dry leaves, he spotted fresh boot prints. They were recent, within the last 24 hours, and clearly not the heavy utilitarian treads of local woodsmen. These were crisper, newer, belonging to expensive tactical boots. Nearby, a glint of white caught his eye, a discarded cigarette butt, its filter untouched by the elements, a high-end brand Daniel recognized from his previous encounters with mercenary types. He found another, and then another, indicating a brief pause, a moment of idle observation. Then, in the shadow of a toppled timber stack, a tiny shard of glass, almost invisible, gleamed. Daniel picked it up. It was tinted green, curved, and unmistakably from a pair of night vision binoculars. The most disturbing discovery came when he explored one of the collapsed warehouses. Inside, amidst the rotting crates and rusted equipment, he found the torn remnants of a specialized trap package. The diagram on the faded cardboard box showed a brutal, spring-loaded steel jaw, designed to ensnare something large and incredibly powerful. A grim picture formed in his mind. The snap of steel, the desperate struggles of a powerful creature. Nearby, nestled in the damp earth, were spent shell casings, not standard hunting rifle rounds, but heavy military-grade brass, indicating powerful firearms. These findings confirmed his worst fears. This wasn't just a band of poachers looking for a quick buck. These were professional hunters, well-equipped, ruthless, and efficient. He imagined the cold glint in their eyes, the casual cruelty with which they'd set those traps, the way they'd think of werewolves not as living beings, but as targets, as prizes. His jaw tightened. He knew their kind. For them, a werewolf was merely an obstacle, a monster to be eliminated, its death bringing both a bounty and a twisted sense of accomplishment. The thought stoked a simmering anger in his gut, a heat that fought against the cold dread that was trying to creep in. Daniel began his methodical sweep of the area around the camp, moving like a phantom, his senses alive to every subtle shift in the environment. He wasn't just looking for werewolf tracks now. He was searching for signs of the other threat, the one his intelligence had warned him about, the distorted predators that even these mercenaries knew to avoid. He found unusual marks on the bark of several towering Douglas firs. Deep, ragged gouges, too high for a bear, too wide for a wolf. Something enormous and unnatural had scraped its way past, tearing at the wood in a frenzy. The marks were old, but indicated a power far beyond any animal he knew. A faint breeze shifted, bringing with it new, unsettling odors. Beyond the familiar, comforting smells of pine and damp earth, there was a faint but distinct stench of old blood, iron-rich and cloying, mixed with the acrid tang of gunpowder and the raw, unwashed odor of human sweat. The combination was sickening, a visceral punch to the gut. These smells were too fresh, too potent to be mere residual traces. Hale's men were already in the vicinity. The clock was ticking. That night, under a sky choked with heavy clouds that promised rain, Daniel moved silently through the perimeter he'd established. He checked his tripwires, tested the sensors. As he crept through a dense patch of thorny huckleberry bushes, he froze. Voices. Low, guttural, indistinct. He dropped instantly into the cover of the brush, pressing himself flat against the cold, damp earth. A patrol of mercenaries. Their boots crunched lightly on the pine needles, their flashlights, muted by red filters, cut through the oppressive gloom. He heard fragments of their conversation. Tonight. Movement. Full moon. The words were cold, unsentimental, like commands issued by automatons. Time, Daniel realized with a sickening lurch, was running out. They were close. Too close. He retreated from the perimeter, his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the silent forest. He gripped his rifle, its cool steel a familiar weight in his hands. He knew now. The attack was imminent. He had to find the pack, not just to protect them, but to warn them. His new mission, once a hazy ideal, had solidified into a concrete, terrifying reality. He plunged deeper into the forest, away from the stench of human cruelty, and toward the territory the werewolves called home. He had to find them before Hale's men forced them out of hiding, before the greedy, fearful hearts of men destroyed what they didn't understand. The night that followed was moonless, swallowed by a thick blanket of clouds, yet somehow clear, with a crispness in the air that hinted at lingering frost. Daniel, moving like a shadow among shadows, picked his way along a narrow game trail, his boots barely disturbing the fallen needles and damp earth. Every sense was alive, heightened to a degree that usually only came in the heat of a desperate hunt. He felt each subtle shift in the wind, the way it carried the scent of wet pine and distant wood smoke. He heard the faint rustle of dry leaves, the tiny drip of moisture from the branches overhead. the almost imperceptible scurry of unseen creatures in the underbrush. He wasn't just searching for tracks. He was searching for a scent, a particular resonance in the air that would tell him he was close to the pack, a primal signature that would differentiate them from the common wildlife. He moved for what felt like hours, deeper and deeper into the hushed heart of the woods, where the trees grew so close together that the canopy became a solid, impenetrable ceiling. Eventually he reached a small, overgrown stream, its banks choked with thorny bushes and ancient moss-covered rocks. And there, amidst the gloom, he saw movement. Several shadows, slender and swift, darted between the towering trunks. He dropped instantly, crouching low behind a fallen log, his carbine rising to his shoulder, ready for anything. His heart thudded a heavy rhythm against his ribs. He prepared himself for the hulking, transformed bodies of full-grown werewolves, for the guttural snarls and the flash of fangs. But as the figures drew closer, emerging from the deeper gloom near the gurgling water, Daniel lowered his weapon, a cold shock running through him. Instead of the monstrous forms he expected, he saw 3 teenagers. They were no older than 14 or 16, their frames gaunt beneath worn, threadbare clothes. Their faces, pale and drawn, were etched with a kind of sickly pallor, a stark testament to chronic malnutrition and constant, debilitating fear. Their eyes, wide and luminous in the scarce light, reflected the faint glimmer of the stars that occasionally pierced the cloud cover, holding within them a deep, ancient terror. They froze, every muscle tensed, when they saw him. They were like cornered animals ready to bolt or to lash out in a desperate last-ditch defense. Their gazes, fixed on him, were a mixture of utter horror and profound distrust. Daniel saw no monsters in their eyes, no predatory hunger, only the raw, unvarnished fear of children who had seen too much and known too little comfort. It was a sight that clawed at something deep within him, something he thought had been long dead. He noted the crude, pathetic weapons they held. The tallest of them, a boy with dark, lank hair, clutched a self-made wooden spear, its tip crudely sharpened, almost comically ineffective against anything more substantial than a squirrel. Another, a girl with wide, frightened eyes, held a similar smaller spear. The third, the thinnest of the trio, a boy whose frame trembled even as he stood still, had an old, rusted, serrated knife clutched in his hand, its blade nicked and dull, hanging from a loop on his frayed belt. These weren't weapons of war or even of skilled hunting. They were desperate tools, symbols of their vulnerability, their desperate, childish attempts to defend themselves against a world that clearly wanted them dead. Daniel, with movements that were slow, deliberate, and painstakingly visible, lowered his carbine. He let the buttstock touch the damp earth, then, with equal care, unclipped the magazine and removed it, holding it up, empty for them to see. The metallic click echoed unnaturally loud in the quiet woods. It was an unheard-of gesture for him, a breach of every rule, every ingrained instinct he'd developed over his decades as a hunter. His hands, accustomed to the cold, lethal weight of a loaded weapon, felt strangely naked without it. "I didn't come here to hurt you," Daniel said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper stripped of any hint of threat or aggression. It was laden with a profound, weary conviction that surprised even himself. "I know you don't hunt humans. I'm here to protect you." He held their gazes, one by one, trying to convey the sincerity of his words. the desperate truth of his intentions. He projected a calmness he barely felt, trying to bridge the chasm of fear and distrust that separated them. In their eyes, he saw a deep, ingrained wariness, a suspicion born of generations of fear, a primal distrust of anyone bearing the scent of man. But beneath the fear, in the shadow depths of their dilated pupils, Daniel caught a fleeting glimpse of something else, a fragile spark of desperation, mingled with a flicker of hope. It was not an illusion. They didn't flee. They remained rooted to the spot, tense, unmoving, their gazes fixed on him, their young minds struggling to reconcile the figure before them with the terrifying image of the hunters they knew. They searched for a tell, a sign of deception, but found only the stark, weathered honesty of a man profoundly weary of bloodshed. The moment stretched, taut and silent, until the only sound was the distant murmur of the stream and the frantic pounding of Daniel's own heart. He knew that this fragile sliver of a second, was everything. It was the precipice upon which his entire mission balanced. He had revealed himself, exposed his hand. He waited, watched, and recognized that the desperation in their eyes was stronger than the fear. The air around them, cold and damp, hummed with unspoken questions. He smelled their fear, acrid and sharp, but beneath it, he detected a faint, hopeful tremor. He had offered them truth, and in this wilderness of lies and terror, that was enough. After his unsettling but necessary surveillance of Hale's mercenary camp, Daniel pushed deeper into the Montana wilderness, confirming the chilling whispers about the true threat. He sought the wildest, most untrammeled sections of the forest, carefully avoiding both the mercenary territory and the known werewolf den. He was looking for anomalies, for places where the natural order had been twisted, where the very pulse of life beat to a different, unsettling rhythm. He sought out unusual tracks, unheard of sounds, and those dread dead zones where the vibrant tapestry of the forest had inexplicably fallen silent. He found such places. The air in these pockets of desolation was not merely cold, but dense, oppressive, carrying a thick, cloying stench of decay and something acrid, utterly unnatural, like burnt ozone mixed with ancient rust. Here the trees themselves writhed in agony, their trunks impossibly gnarled, their branches reached like skeletal fingers towards a sky they couldn't quite touch. The undergrowth was either sickly, withered to a brittle brown, or unnaturally vibrant, mutated into grotesque, unfamiliar forms. Even the most resilient forest creatures, the squirrels and deer, the tenacious rabbits, meticulously avoided these blighted patches. There was no sign of tracks, no faint rustle of life. Birds, usually a constant chorus, were utterly silent. The forest itself held its breath, trying not to draw attention to these festering wounds. In one such spot, a clearing where the ground was perpetually damp and spongy, Daniel discovered what made his blood run cold. These weren't the tracks of bears, heavy and ponderous, nor the familiar prints of wolves, sleek and predatory. These were monstrous. The imprints on the wet earth were far too large, unmistakably clawed, but with an unnatural splay to the digits, fingers elongated, impossibly jointed. The deep splayed prints indicated a creature of immense weight, yet one that moved with a sickeningly fluid grace. Nearby, on the bark of a centuries-old pine, were deep, ragged gouges, scoring the wood like angry scars. They were not claw marks. They were deep furrows, as if a gigantic, misshapen limb, a monstrous elbow or shoulder, had dragged itself past, tearing at the sturdy tree in its passage. Soon after, following a barely perceptible trail of withered vegetation, he stumbled upon remains. An animal, undoubtedly a deer, lay sprawled in a grotesque tableau. But this was no ordinary kill. The carcass wasn't merely dismembered or torn apart by a predator. It was mutilated. The body was grotesquely deformed, limbs twisted at impossible angles, flesh inverted, organs somehow drawn out and desiccated. There were no clean bite marks, no clear signs of teeth. Only ragged, unnaturally wide lacerations. Something with immense, blunt force had torn the creature apart. The meat was not consumed. The very life force had been sucked dry, leaving behind a husk of horror. The sight was enough to make even Daniel's hardened stomach churn, and he fought back the bile that threatened to rise. The silence in these anomalous zones was the most terrifying element of all. It was not the peaceful hush of an undisturbed forest, but a dead, oppressive quiet. No rustle of leaves, no chirp of birds, no buzz of insects. It was a silence that pressed down on the nerves, creating a suffocating sensation of vast, ancient power, of a presence so utterly alien and incomprehensibly dangerous that it warped the very fabric of existence around it. He stood on the edge of a void, hearing the hungry emptiness beyond. Daniel felt a prickle on the back of his neck, the primal instinct of being watched. He was close. Too close. Then, from the deeper reaches of the blighted forest, a sound drifted to him, a faint guttural growl, low and rumbling, like the grinding of tectonic plates deep within the earth. It was punctuated by a sickening noise, a sound like metal scraping against bone, followed by a deep, wet, bubbling sigh. It was utterly devoid of any animalistic quality. Something twisted, wrong. Daniel dropped to a knee, pressing himself against the cold, damp earth, his carbine rising to his shoulder, the safety clicking off with a soft, almost imperceptible sound. His breath hitched in his throat. These sounds, they were not of this world. They were distorted. These gruesome discoveries, these blighted landscapes and unsettling noises, cemented Daniel's mission with an ironclad certainty. The werewolf pack, once his prey, was not a threat. They were a shield, a living barrier. They weren't merely surviving in these unforgiving woods. They were actively holding back something far darker, far more ancient, something that, at the merest hint of its unfettered emergence, would consume all life in the surrounding region. His decision to protect the werewolves was no longer merely a matter of personal morality or a quest for redemption. It was a stark, brutal question of survival, not just for the pack, but for the entire human population of the surrounding valleys. A desperate last stand against a horror that defied human comprehension. He was no longer just a hunter. He was a sentry on the edge of an abyss. After his chilling encounter with the true nameless horror lurking in the blighted zones of the forest, Daniel knew time was no longer a luxury he could afford. He had to find the werewolf pack, and he had to convince them of his sincerity, of his drastically altered purpose. He abandoned his meticulous stealth, instead moving deliberately, directly, toward the known location of their den. As he moved, he left subtle but unmistakable signals. A snapped twig placed just so, a particular stone turned upside down at a junction. Messages that only experienced trackers, or those whose senses were keenly attuned to the forest's hidden language, would decipher. He was, in essence, laying out breadcrumbs not to be followed, but to be found, a deliberate revelation of his path. He eventually emerged into a small, natural clearing, a bowl-shaped depression in the dense woods where the light, even on this overcast day, gathered. The air here was cooler, imbued with the sharp tang of pine and the faint, earthy scent of disturbed soil. And then, without a single rustle, without a whisper of warning, they were there. From behind the towering pines, from the shadows clinging to the edge of the clearing, they stepped forth. There were about 10 of them, and more, all in their human forms, but their eyes glowed with an unconcealed ferocity, tempered only by a profound, wary caution. Daniel recognized the 3 teenagers he'd encountered days earlier. Their pale faces now held not only fear, but a flicker of raw, unvarnished curiosity, mixed with an almost desperate hope. A figure stepped forward, separating himself from the cluster of silent bodies. This was Silas, undoubtedly the Alpha. He was a powerfully built man, broad-shouldered, with a thick mane of salt and pepper hair and a face carved by years of hard living and harder decisions. His eyes, a piercing shade of hazel, were like polished stones, capable of seeing through pretenses, of stripping away falsehoods. He exuded a calm yet absolute authority, a palpable strength that needed no overt display. "You've killed our kind before," Silas said, his voice deep and even, but with an underlying current of iron that resonated in the still air. "Why are you here, Hunter?" His question was both an accusation and a judgment, echoing the years of bloodshed, the centuries of animosity between their kinds. Daniel felt the immense weight of his past pressing down on him, a crushing burden of guilt and regret. He saw the pain, the profound distrust, the ingrained hatred in the eyes of the werewolves surrounding him, a hatred he himself had helped forge. This was the moment of truth, the precipice. He couldn't just offer flimsy excuses. He had to lay bare his soul, conveying the seismic shift that had occurred within him. He had to show them not just his intentions, but his very essence, the damaged, weary man he had become. He didn't equivocate. He didn't try to sugarcoat the truth. "I killed those I believed were monsters," Daniel replied, meeting Silas's piercing gaze unflinchingly. His own voice was rough, scarred by years of disuse, but imbued with a raw honesty. "I came here because, for the first time, I see those who fight not for themselves, but for others. You protect this forest from something far worse than you could ever be. And you, in turn, are being hunted by people who are worse than any monster." He allowed his gaze to sweep across the faces of the pack, letting them read the truth in his weary eyes, the unshakable conviction that now defined him. A profound, tense silence descended upon the clearing, broken only by the soft sigh of the wind through the pines. The werewolves, Silas foremost among them, studied him, their senses straining to detect any tremor of deceit, any subtle scent of a lie. Daniel knew they were reading him, sifting through his words, trying to reconcile the notorious hunter with the man who stood before them, unarmed, vulnerable, and pleading for an alliance. They detected the metallic tang of steel, the faint odor of gunpowder that clung to his clothes, but they also detected the scent of deep exhaustion, of profound despair, and, surprisingly, of undeniable sincerity. In their eyes, Daniel witnessed a primal struggle, a conflict between generations of ingrained hatred and the sudden, bewildering possibility of help. Silas, after what felt like an eternity, finally nodded, a slow, almost imperceptible movement of his powerful head. "Prove it," he said. His voice still low, still laced with caution. But now, something else had entered it, a challenging note, a flicker of something beyond mere contempt. It was a test, an invitation to demonstrate his worth, a fragile chance at redemption. Daniel understood. This wasn't the end of his journey. It was merely the beginning, the first uncertain step on a path that would demand everything he had. He was ready to walk it, whatever the cost. The pale light of the overcast sky illuminated the weight of his decision, and the ominous chill of the forest felt less like a threat and more like a challenge. Silas's terse challenge proved it, hung in the cold, damp air of the clearing, a gauntlet thrown down that Daniel was more than ready to pick up. He began with an impromptu briefing for Silas and several of the pack's elders, their faces grim and impassive, their eyes sharp with skepticism. Daniel laid out his evidence with the precision of a seasoned detective, meticulously describing the distorted predators he'd encountered. He detailed the unsettling alien tracks he'd found in the blighted zones, the grotesque, mutated vegetation, the pervasive, unnatural cold, and the horrifying, desiccated remains of the deer, not merely torn but somehow deformed, sucked dry. He drew upon his vast, disturbing mental database of monstrous encounters, explaining that this was something ancient, something interdimensional, a terror that transcended their own understanding of the natural world. He spoke of its complete lack of discernible predation pattern, its sheer, senseless, destructive power. Next, Daniel unfurled his worn topographic maps, spreading them on the damp earth. He pointed out the mercenary positions, detailing their observation posts, the locations of their specialized traps, and their projected routes of attack. He demonstrated an intimate knowledge of their tactics, the specific types of weapons they carried, thermal scopes, suppressed firearms, chemical irritants, and their cold, professional behavior. His detailed insight into their methods elicited a mixture of surprise and grudging respect from the elders. He stressed their ruthlessness, their efficiency, and the cold, unfeeling nature of their hunt. He didn't mince words. These were not men to be underestimated. After the briefing, Silas, though still wary, gave his assent for a first joint patrol. Daniel, armed only with a hunting knife, and his profound knowledge of both forest and foe, set out with 2 young werewolves. The lean, nervous teenager he had first encountered by the stream, whose name was now known to him as Finn, and a slightly older, powerfully built young man named Elias. Daniel began to instruct them, teaching them the subtle arts of covert movement through areas controlled by humans. He showed them how to detect tripwires and pressure plates, how to read disturbances in the undergrowth that signaled a hidden mine, how to track an enemy without leaving any discernible trace. He taught them to move with a blend of their inherent animal stealth and his human cunning. On that patrol, their training was put to an immediate, harrowing test. They discovered a freshly set trap, a brutal, spring-loaded steel jaw designed to snap shut on a werewolf's leg, half hidden beneath a layer of pine needles. Finn, moving with a youthful eagerness that bordered on carelessness, almost stepped into it. Daniel reacted in a blur of motion. With a guttural shout, he shoved the boy back, his hand shooting out to deflect Finn's foot, narrowly saving him from a bone-shattering fate. Without a word, his face a mask of grim determination, Daniel disarmed the trap, its powerful jaws snapping shut with a dull thud, echoing through the silent forest. That moment, that instant of shared peril and Daniel's selfless action, became the first real step toward trust, a silent, unspoken pact forged in the cold heart of the woods. Finn looked at Daniel with wide, new eyes, a deep respect replacing the lingering fear. That evening, Silas, his gaze still appraising, allowed Daniel to remain within the pack's camp. Daniel watched their life unfold around him, a fascinating tapestry of instinct and ritual. He observed their quiet interactions, their fierce loyalty, the way they moved as a single, cohesive unit. He saw how they cared for their young, how they honored their elders, how they moved through the forest with a quiet reverence he hadn't expected. For the first time in more years than he counted, Daniel felt something beyond the bone-deep weariness, a strange sense of belonging, a warmth that fought against the pervasive chill of the Montana night. Later, around a crackling campfire, its flames throwing dancing shadows against the ancient trees, Finn approached him. The boy's eyes, no longer shadowed by fear, held a profound curiosity. He asked Daniel about his change of heart, about why a renowned monster hunter would suddenly choose to protect them. Daniel didn't reveal everything, not the full, agonizing extent of his past. But he spoke of seeing too much evil in the world, an evil that often emanated not from the so-called monsters, but from the hearts of men. He spoke, in hushed tones, of losing loved ones to creatures of the night, and how that profound, soul-shattering loss had paradoxically opened his eyes to deeper truths. That not all monsters were inherently evil, and not all men were inherently good. He spoke of the gray spaces, the terrible, lonely middle ground where he had lived for so long. As the embers of the campfire slowly died down, a new, chilling wave of news swept through the camp. Scouts, their faces grim and streaked with dirt, returned with alarming reports. The mercenaries were no longer merely patrolling. They had begun an aggressive push deeper into the forest. They were burning underbrush, leaving scorched earth and choking smoke in their wake, systematically trying to flush the werewolves from their hidden sanctuaries. The smell of distant smoke, acrid and bitter, began to taint the night air. The time for battle, Daniel realized, was no longer approaching slowly. It was here, pressing down on them, an inexorable tide. The final confrontation was only hours away, and the weight of it settled heavy in Daniel's heart. He stood, feeling the cool metal of his knife against his hip, ready to face whatever the night brought. With the mercenary offensive now undeniably underway, Daniel found himself at the heart of the pack's council, an unlikely figure amidst the silent, wary faces of the elders and the simmering frustration of the younger werewolves. He had earned his place for now by deed and by honest word. He unfurled his maps once more, sketching out his plan of defense, a strategy built on his intimate knowledge of human tactics and the unforgiving intricacies of the forest itself. He proposed a labyrinth of traps and ambushes, using the very terrain against their attackers, turning the mercenaries' supposed advantage into a deadly snare. He spoke of choke points, of diversionary tactics, of using the dense undergrowth and the ancient twisted trees as both cover and weapon. The internal conflict within the pack was palpable. Young, hot-blooded werewolves, their muscles tensed beneath their skin, seethed with a desperate desire for immediate retaliation, a head-on charge to drive back the invaders. Their eyes burned with a primal fury. But the elders, their faces etched with the wisdom of countless battles and the scars of bitter experience, cautioned against open conflict with heavily armed men. They spoke of the devastating power of bullets, of the ruthlessness of human hunters. Silas listened, his powerful frame radiating a quiet authority, his gaze moving from the eager young to the cautious old. The final word, as always, rested with him. After a long, agonizing silence, he nodded slowly, a decision made. Daniel's plan, with its cold logic and brutal effectiveness, had won. Training commenced immediately, under the cloak of night. Daniel, drawing on every lesson learned from his previous life, taught the werewolves how to move, fight, and survive against firearms. He showed them the vulnerable spots in body armor, the soft points where a well-placed claw or strike incapacitated. He instructed them in the art of using cover, of breaking line of sight, of striking from the deepest shadows before melting away again, minimizing their exposure to suppressive fire. He taught them not just to attack, but to endure, to maximize their natural advantages against the terrifying lethality of modern weaponry. He demonstrated close-quarters combat techniques, showing them how to disarm, how to disable, how to move through a human formation like a whisper of death. As the preparations intensified, Daniel sought out more intelligence on Richard Hale. His sources, a network of whispers and half-truths, yielded a tragic, unsettling detail. Hale had lost his family years ago, not to some random accident, but to a werewolf attack. Not this pack, not these guardians, but to a rogue, vicious beast that had terrorized a remote community in Colorado. This devastating loss had twisted Hale, turning his grief into a fanatical, all-consuming vengeance. He had become an indiscriminate hunter, seeing no difference between one pack and another, only the monstrous reflection of his own pain. This knowledge added a layer of profound tragedy to Hale's image, a twisted pathos that humanized him in a way Daniel found profoundly disturbing. Yet it did nothing to justify his current monstrous actions. Hale was a man consumed by his own devils, and that made him all the more dangerous. The mercenaries began their final, relentless push. Daniel, positioned high on a ridge, intercepted their radio communications, the crackle and hiss of the airwaves bringing Hale's chilling voice directly to him. The former soldier's voice, amplified by the static, was a hateful sermon, full of righteous anger and promises of a bloody reckoning. He spoke of cleansing and swore that no monster would survive this night. The words were cold, devoid of mercy, a chilling declaration of intent that sent a tremor of dread through Daniel. The attack was coming. As the full moon, enormous and radiant, began its slow ascent above the jagged peaks of the Montana mountains, bathing the ancient forest in its cold, silvery light, a profound tension settled over the werewolf camp. The air thrummed with a primal energy. They prepared for the painful yet necessary transformation. Daniel watched, a silent observer, feeling a complex mix of apprehension and profound respect. He saw not just a biological change, but a profound ritual, a spiritual shift, a painful shedding of one skin for another, all in preparation for a desperate struggle for survival. He saw the grim resolve in their eyes, the clenching of their jaws, the visible shuddering that ran through their human frames as the change began. Daniel, his own face a mask of cold determination, took his position on one of the key defense sectors, tucked between Finn and Elias, now both tense and ready. He checked his carbine, cycling around into the chamber with a soft click, the familiar weight a comfort in his hands. He scanned the perimeter, his eyes piercing the silvery gloom, searching for any sign of movement, any flicker of reflected moonlight from a mercenary's scope. The crisp air, now carrying the faintest scent of wood smoke and human sweat, tightened around him. He was no longer a hunter of monsters. Tonight, he was a hunter of men. Men who, in their blind hatred and greed, had chosen to become monsters themselves. The dread was a physical thing, sitting cold and heavy in his stomach, but beneath it a fierce, protective fire began to burn. The night, usually a symphony of rustles and distant calls, held its breath, suspended in an unnatural quiet. Then a single gunshot ripped through the stillness, followed quickly by another, and then a brutal, shattering volley. The forest, ancient and silent only moments before, erupted into a cacophony of violence. Smoke grenades hissed, spewing thick, acrid clouds that mingled with the acrid scent of gunpowder. Stun grenades exploded with blinding flashes and deafening cracks, momentarily disorienting. The mercenaries attacked from multiple directions, moving in tight, disciplined formations, their confidence in their superior firepower a palpable thing. But the forest had its own teeth. In response to the assault, a primeval roar tore through the trees, echoing off the ancient trunks. The werewolves, their transformations complete, their forms hulking and terrifying, burst into the fray. Their attacks were swift, brutal, and utterly deadly. They moved with an astonishing speed, appearing and disappearing in the swirling smoke and deep shadows. They used their intimate knowledge of the terrain, striking from unseen ambushes, tearing through the disciplined ranks of the mercenaries like a monstrous storm. The forest floor, normally a soft bed of needles, became a killing ground. Daniel was in the thick of it, a lone human caught between two worlds. His carbine sang a deadly song, its precise reports cutting through the chaos. He aimed not for the kill, but for incapacitation. Open areas on unarmored limbs, shoulders, legs, felling the mercenaries, disabling them, avoiding the final fatal blow. Yet he saw out of the corner of his eye how his companions, the transformed werewolves, moved with a raw, uncompromising ferocity, their claws and fangs delivering merciless judgments. He provided covering fire, laying down suppressive bursts when they broke cover, and they in turn moved to shield him when he paused to reload, a strange, silent choreography of mutual protection. The initial precision of the mercenary attack quickly dissolved into terrified chaos. Confronted with such a furious, organized, and primal counterattack, many of the human hunters began to panic. Their formations fractured, their discipline evaporated. They scattered, desperate to escape the relentless onslaught of claws and teeth. The screams of wounded men, raw and desperate, mingled with the guttural roars of the werewolves, a horrifying symphony that reverberated through the ancient, blood-soaked trees. The metallic tang of fear and blood was thick in the air. The traps Daniel had meticulously laid with the pack's assistance now began to reap their deadly harvest. Tripwires sent mercenaries sprawling into cleverly dug pits, their cries cut short. Hidden snares wrapped around ankles, pulling men off their feet. Enormous, moss-covered logs, strategically propped, crashed down with splintering force, crushing lines of advancing soldiers. These pre-planned obstacles further disorganized the mercenary ranks. turning their advance into a rout, allowing the werewolves to seize the initiative, transforming defense into a terrifying, relentless offense. In the swirling maelstrom of the battle, Daniel felt a profound shift within himself. The instincts of a hunter, honed over decades, were still there, sharp and precise, but their application had fundamentally changed. He was no longer the lone wolf stalking monstrous prey. He was a protector, a shield. Every shot, every move, every shouted warning was driven by a single overriding purpose: to safeguard this pack, this strange new family he had found. He looked into the eyes of the transformed werewolves, saw not the monstrous forms he had once so readily condemned, but fierce, loyal allies, brothers and sisters in a desperate fight for survival. The cold dread was still there, but now it was tempered by a fierce, burning loyalty. Silas, as Daniel had anticipated, led a devastating counterattack. His roar, a deep, resonant sound, cut through the din of battle, striking terror into the hearts of the remaining mercenaries and galvanizing his pack. He moved with impossible speed and strength, a whirlwind of muscle and fang, breaking through the demoralized lines of the human hunters. He drove relentlessly towards one of the enemy's key strong points, a small, fortified redoubt near a cluster of ancient pines, demonstrating a raw, untamed power that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. The battle for the forest was far from over, but the tide, Daniel felt, was turning. The trees themselves leaned in, watching as the ancient wilderness fought back. The battle, a chaotic symphony of human screams and bestial roars, twisted and turned through the ancient forest. Daniel, his carbine nearly empty, ducked behind the thick trunk of a Douglas fir, slapping a fresh magazine into the weapon with practiced ease. As he moved to flank a group of demoralized mercenaries, he suddenly found himself face to face with Richard Hale. The former military man, his tactical gear torn, his face streaked with dirt and blood, still radiated a fanatical hatred. He was surrounded by a few of his loyalists, their eyes wide with fear, but Hale's burned with an unquenchable fire. He recognized Daniel, his jaw tightening with a terrible realization. "Traitor, you went against your own kind," Hale screamed, his voice hoarse with rage, cutting through the din of the fighting. "You protect monsters." Daniel met his gaze, his own eyes cold and hard. "The monster is you, Hale. You hunt for money and false beliefs, killing those who protect this world from true evil." The words hung in the smoke-laced air, sharp as a blade. Then the two men lunged. A brutal, desperate struggle erupted. Hale, despite his age and the battering he'd taken, was a formidable fighter, his military training evident in every punch and parry. He moved with a practiced savagery, working to overwhelm Daniel with the numerical superiority of his remaining men. Daniel fought back with a ferocity bordering on madness, a primal rage now fully unleashed. He knew, with an absolute certainty, that Hale's defeat would shatter the will of the remaining mercenaries, turning their rout into a complete collapse. He fought not just for his own survival, but for the very existence of the pack. In the swirling vortex of the fight, as Daniel parried a vicious blow from Hale, one of the mercenaries, a scarred, embittered man who had somehow survived the initial onslaught, lunged from behind. Daniel caught a flicker of movement, a dark shape against the chaotic backdrop, and reacted instantly, twisting his body. But he wasn't fast enough. He felt a searing, agonizing pain in his left shoulder, a white-hot spear of agony as something sharp and cold pierced his flesh. A hidden blade, a specialized throwing dart. It was a precise, insidious attack designed to cripple. Before Daniel could even fully register the wound, Finn, the teenager he had saved from the trap, moved like a blur. The young werewolf, his human form still lean but now imbued with a desperate strength, launched himself at the attacking mercenary, tackling him to the ground in a desperate, snarling fury. In that moment of chaos, Daniel saw Hale's face contort in pure horror. One of them, a monster, saving him, the hunter. The sight, the absolute violation of Hale's worldview, momentarily stunned the man. But even in his shock, Hale regained his composure, raising his pistol and firing a wild shot in Daniel's direction. As the bullet whistled towards Daniel, a powerful, hulking figure, another werewolf in its full, terrifying glory, sprang forward. It was Elias, the older of the two young men he'd trained. Elias threw himself in front of Daniel, shielding him with his own body. The bullet grazed Elias, a sickening thud against his side, but he barely registered it, instead seizing the mercenary who had ambushed Daniel, shaking him like a rag doll. In that split second of confusion, as Elias took the bullet and subdued the attacker, Daniel felt a sharp, burning bite on his shoulder near the first wound. It wasn't a bullet. It was something deeper, more visceral, more instinctual. He didn't see who bit him in the chaotic blur, but the pain, a sudden searing fire, shot through him, shaking him to the bones. Finally, Silas, a whirlwind of destructive power, burst into this sector of the battle. He saw Daniel, wounded and reeling, saw his pack fighting to protect him. A primal roar of pure fury erupted from his throat. Silas launched himself at Hale and his remaining men, a force of nature unleashed. With a single, devastating blow, he shattered Hale's resistance. The former military man fell, his face a mask of terror and disbelief, his hateful eyes staring blankly at the chaos around him. The last bastion of mercenary resistance crumbled, their spirit broken, their fight extinguished. The forest slowly began to quiet, the sounds of battle fading into scattered cries and the soft panting of the victorious. As the first faint streaks of dawn bruised the eastern sky, painting the ragged peaks of the mountains in hues of gray and bruised purple, the battle finally subsided. The forest, which had roared with primal fury only hours before, now held a haunted stillness. It bore the ugly scars of the brutal clash. The twisted, broken bodies of mercenaries lay scattered among the pines, their sophisticated gear rendered useless. Trees, ancient sentinels, were splintered and torn, their bark gouged by claws and perforated by bullets. The air, though clearing, still held the acrid tang of gunpowder, wood smoke, and the metallic, coppery scent of freshly spilled blood. The pack, exhausted but victorious, began to gather, their human forms slowly emerging from the receding shadows, tending to their wounds, both visible and unseen. Daniel sat slumped against a massive, moss-covered pine, its ancient roots providing a hard, unyielding support. Around him, the grim aftermath of the fight stretched out, a testament to the night's violence. His left shoulder throbbed with a dull, insistent pain, a deep ache from the wound he'd sustained. But it wasn't the physical injury that held his focus. His eyes, though tired, held a profound sense of relief, a quiet satisfaction that went bone deep. He looked at the surviving members of the pack, their faces streaked with dirt and blood, their expressions weary but resolute. They had won. Against overwhelming odds, they had prevailed. There were several wounded among them, but thanks to Daniel's preparations and his relentless guiding hand, Their losses were mercifully minimal. Silas approached Daniel, his powerful frame now returned to its human form. His face was serious, etched with the grim lines of battle, but in his eyes a new emotion mingled with the remnants of the fight, a profound respect, an undeniable gratitude. "You saved us, Hunter," Silas said, his voice deep and resonant, imbued with a newfound sincerity. "You fought like one of us." He extended a hand, scarred and powerful, and helped Daniel to his feet. Silas then paused, his gaze hardening, though not with anger. "But there is a matter of the Pack's law," he continued, his voice lowering, becoming gravely serious. "You know too much about us now. Our secrets cannot be allowed to leave this forest. By the ancient law, there are only two paths for you. You must become one of us, or you must die." The words, stark and uncompromising, hung in the cold morning air. It wasn't a threat, Daniel realized. It was simply the immutable truth of their existence, the cold, hard reality of their world. Daniel looked at Silas, then at the faces of the pack members gathered around them, their eyes expectant, watchful. He considered resistance, argument, and escape. But a dry, weary laugh escaped his lips, devoid of bitterness, tinged only with a profound, fatalistic understanding. He understood. It wasn't a choice presented to him in that moment, but a recognition of a choice already made, a destiny already set in motion. He had walked this path, step by step, toward this very crossroads. Slowly, with a painful grimace, Daniel tore at the sleeve of his shirt, exposing his left shoulder. Beneath the fabric, the wound from the hidden blade was a vivid, angry crimson, swollen and painful. But beside it, surrounding it, was something else. A deep, painfully distended bite mark, its edges bruised and purple. From the center of the bite, a network of dark, angry veins began to spiderweb across his skin, a stark, undeniable testament to a nascent, terrifying transformation already at work. It wasn't Hale's bullet that had sealed his fate. It was the bite received in the wild, chaotic maelstrom of the battle. A wound he hadn't even registered until now. A silent, insidious seed taking root within him. "The decision was already made, Silas," Daniel said, his voice quiet, his gaze strangely calm. He looked at the bite, then back at the Alpha. Silas's eyes widened, a flicker of understanding, surprise, and a strange, dawning respect mingling in their depths. Daniel's fate, it was now clear, had been sealed not by his conscious choice to defend the pack, but by a deeper, wilder force, long before his weary pickup had ever coughed its way into these ancient, shadowed woods. The path to redemption, he realized, had led him to a transformation he never anticipated, a rebirth into the very thing he had once hunted. The last, lingering light of the setting moon, a sliver of silver against the deepening gray, bled from the sky, ushering in the false dawn. Daniel sat, leaning against the rough bark of the pine, his body a canvas of aches and pains. But beneath the familiar thrum of physical suffering, he felt a new sensation, a strange, creeping warmth spreading from his shoulder wound, reaching into his bones down to his very marrow. The pain intensified, a deep primal burn, but it no longer felt alien. It felt right, a necessary purification. He felt the shift beginning, a subtle, profound realignment of his very being. Slowly, quietly, the members of the pack approached him. They were in their human forms, their faces still showing the weariness of battle, but their eyes held a new understanding, a deep, silent recognition. They saw his wound, the dark, spreading veins, and comprehended his fate. The fear and distrust that had once lingered in their gaze had vanished, replaced by acceptance, respect, and a quiet relief. Finn, the teenager he had saved, stepped forward, his young face solemn, and silently offered Daniel a flask of water. Daniel took it, his fingers brushing the boy's, and felt a strange current pass between them. With the first true rays of the sun burning through the thick, needled branches overhead, painting the forest floor in dappled gold, Daniel felt a final, agonizing wave of pain wash over him. Then just as quickly it receded, replaced by something utterly new. A surge of strength, raw and untamed, yet paradoxically, profoundly tranquil. He looked at his hands, seeing them not just as they were, but as they would be, feeling the subtle, powerful changes already at work beneath his skin. He knew with an absolute certainty that he would never again be the man he once was. The old Daniel Hayes, the lonely hunter of monsters, was gone, shed like an old skin. The final, breathtaking panorama of dawn unfolded over the majestic Montana mountains. The jagged peaks, cloaked in ancient snow, were set ablaze with the fiery gold and soft rose hues of the rising sun. Daniel sat amidst the fallen mercenaries, their bodies cold and still, not as a conqueror, but as an integral part of the landscape, a new evolving element of the ancient forest, a silent witness to the endless cycle of death and rebirth. Around him, the pack sat in their human forms, their faces illuminated by the new day's light. They no longer hid in the deep shadows, no longer feared the encroaching human world. They had emerged from the battle bruised, but united. They looked at him, their expressions a quiet blend of understanding and welcoming, and Daniel knew with a certainty that settled deep in his soul that this was his new family. They had fought together, bled together, and now they would live together. His gaze, fixed on the distant, radiant horizon, was calm. There was no trace of the old weariness, no lingering bitterness from a life of solitude and violence. Only a deep, unshakable sense of belonging, a profound peace he had never known. He had spent his entire life hunting monsters, always feeling like a solitary wolf, an outcast. Now he was part of a pack, part of a formidable ancient force, one that protected this world from the lurking darkness. Daniel understood, with a clarity that finally settled all the unsettled dust of his past, that for the very first time in his long haunted existence, he had found not just a purpose, not just survival, but a home, a place where he truly belonged, where his strength and his newfound nature would serve not destruction, but protection. He was no longer the hunter of monsters. He was one of them, a guardian. And this feeling, this profound sense of acceptance and belonging, was the greatest, most unexpected gift he had ever received. A quiet, fierce dawn breaking within his own battered heart.